The New York Giants were established in 1883 and are a cornerstone of baseball history. They boasted legendary players like Christy Mathewson, Willie Mays, and Mel Ott. They played at the iconic Polo Grounds and won 17 National League pennants and 5 World Series titles before relocating to San Francisco. While the New York Yankees and Brooklyn Dodgers often get most of the nostalgia coverage, the Giants deserve that same interest level. We're going to look at the club's fascinating history today on Rounders, a history of baseball in America. Hey, baseball fans. Welcome to Rounders, your baseball history podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Lambert. Get ready to step into the time machine with us, and we're not just talking stats and scores. We're digging into the heart and soul of the players, teams, and countries that have made this a global sport. From the underdog stories to those jaw-dropping moments, Rounders is your front seat to the epic journey of baseball. So grab a seat in the digital bleachers, relax, and let's swing for the fences together. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another week, another show. I am your host, Jeff Lambert. Thanks for joining me. It's great to be with you. We're going back to one of our most popular series on the show, which is called Team Autopsies. This is where we look at franchises that are no longer around, at least under their original names. We have several entries in this series. If you're new to the show, we've talked about the Seattle Pilots, the Houston Colt 45s, the St. Louis Browns. There's so many that we've covered so far, so I would encourage you to look into our back catalog so you can catch up on some of the other franchises that we've done. Now, today's team that we're focusing on, the New York Giants, is one that I've been wanting to do for quite a while, simply because I think the Giants carry such a rich history for us to be able to unearth and rediscover. So there's so many top moments going through the research process. It was difficult to narrow this down into an episode that was, in a length that I felt comfortable putting out. But, I went through the same sections we normally go through. We're going to talk about how the club was founded. We're going to talk about where they played. We're going to talk about the logos and the uniforms. We're going to go through their history era by era and talk about the highs and the lows. And then we're going to talk about what happened to them, what caused that original, group, that original name, that original place that they were from, why they decided to move or go defunct, what happened there. So we're going to analyze that as well. So I want to thank you just real quick for sticking with me. I appreciate the fact that you make this a part of your weekly rotation for podcasts. It means a lot to me. I love doing this. And if it weren't for you tuning in and giving me feedback and enjoying what's being put out, I wouldn't continue with this. So again, thank you to you, the people who take time to check out this show. So without further ado, let's get into our autopsy of the New York Giants. In our first section, we're going to talk about the founding figures of the New York Giants. Who established this historic franchise? Well, that accolade goes to two key figures, guys named John B. Day and Jim Mutry. Let's look at each of them individually. John B. Day was a guy that was known throughout his life as being very deeply passionate about baseball, especially in its early years. And he recognized from a business standpoint the potential of professional teams in New York. He was born nearby in Colchester, Connecticut in 1847, and he became a successful businessman pretty early on in his life in the tobacco industry. Once he made his millions, yes, he was a millionaire by the mid-1800s, he decided that he was going to turn his attention to baseball. He wanted to found clubs. He thought it was a good way to diversify his revenue. He believed in the sport, and he thought if he founded the right clubs and invested in them properly, that it could be a way to finance his hobby and to see the sport grow. So he was not a stingy owner. He financed the teams that he started very generously because he wanted to make sure that they had the resources to compete at the highest level. So that's John B. Day. Let's talk about Jim Mutry. Mutry was born nearby in Chelsea, Massachusetts in 1851. And he had built a reputation by the 1880s as a guy who was a very experienced amateur baseball player, and he was a sharp club manager. He had managed several different teams and different associations, known for being a great guy on the field and a guy that had a strategic mind off the field. He had a keen eye for picking out young talent. He had that strategic mind to know how to guide clubs to wins. And these two gentlemen were seen as complementary to each other. One had the business expertise, and one had the on-field player and baseball strategy expertise. So they combined forces, and together they formed a professional baseball club called the New York Gothams in 1883. And that club entered the newly formed National League. Now, their partnership extended beyond the Gothams. They founded one team, but they also decided to found another team to spread out their baskets, if you will, spread out their apples in different baskets. They founded another squad called the New York Metropolitans, who played in a rival league called the American Association. Keep in mind, the National League had just been founded in 1876. There were several professional associations vying for players and attention from fans. So again, they decided, let's start a team in the National League and let's start a team in the American Association. So this dual involvement allowed them to manage player rosters strategically. It was quite ahead of their time for how they set this up. And what they would do is they would switch players back and forth when they needed between leagues. Now, the Metropolitans were actually the more successful of the two franchises early on. They won the American Association pennant in 1884. But as time went on, Day and Mutry more and more started to focus on the New York Gothams, and they would send their better players and more funding to that franchise. But the story here, I think, early on is that we see an innovative idea of using multiple clubs to develop talent. You could consider it a forerunner of the major minor league approach. So this multi-club talent development, it significantly influenced the success and development of the Gothams in particular. So let's talk about how the Gothams became the Giants. So the transition from one team name to the other occurred shortly after their founding in 1883. Fast forward with me 2 years to 1885. Now the story goes that after a commanding win by the Gothams, team co-owner Jim Mutry, who was really excited, he was brimming with pride, he referred to his players loudly and publicly as my big fellows, my Giants. So that is kind of the urban legend that said, oh, that's where the name the Giants came from. It was Mutry saying that. Well, there has been some recent research that has shown that fans were already using this nickname before the 1885 season. And it kind of just adds to that story to show that there was already a reference that the Giants were, more popular than the Gotham's name. And of course, eventually that name stuck and they became known as the Giants as time went on. So you have the founding of that club, at least in terms of the name change. What happened to their second club, the Metropolitans? Somewhat interesting. So the New York Metropolitans, they faded as the Giants became more popular and commanded more attention. And the Gothams, who became the Giants, they were getting more fans. They were getting more press coverage. So again, Day and Mutry started to fund more and more money to the Gothams. They started to fund more and more of their top talent over there. And any star players that were developed on the Metropolitans, they would go over to the Gotham/Giants. And that led to a further decline in the club's performance. So as the American Association started to crumble and face financial stress, so did the Metropolitans, and they actually disbanded in 1887, shortly after their founding. And many of the remaining players on the Metropolitans simply moved over to the Giants along with the star players. And that further strengthened an already formidable roster that the Giants had fielded from taking the best players from the Metropolitans. So that's how the Giants came to be. So now let's talk about where the Giants played. So the team played mainly in one place throughout their time in New York, and it was known as the Polo Grounds, which is this hallowed hall in baseball history, right? It was the stadium in Upper Manhattan. It had this distinctive horseshoe shape, which had a really deep center field. And you have to remember that the Polo Grounds were converted from an actual polo field where, the game was played. It wasn't designed to be a baseball stadium. So it had these really weird dimensions that kind of added to its charm, also made it more difficult, especially for outfielders. But this was the place where the Giants called home. But there were 4 different versions of the Polo Grounds. I think that's important. It wasn't one static stadium that they played in. So let me go through the iterations of the Polo Grounds. The first version was known as Brotherhood Park. And that was initially the polo field that they converted into a baseball stadium when the team was founded. And the Giants played there for 5 years, from 1883 to 1888. But in 1888, a fire destroyed the original Polo Grounds. So what we saw was the team moved to a second iteration. The place was rebuilt, and in 1890, the team started playing games there. They played in other local neighborhood stadiums while the construction was going on. But that was short lived. It only lasted 2 years, the second version, because it was quickly seen as inadequate to be able to hold the team, the amount of fans that were trying to show up. So then we have the third version of the Polo Grounds, which was unveiled in 1891. And this became the main home for the Giants from 1891 to 1911. That was the stadium as it was seen for more than 20 years. But then we see in 1911, the fourth version of the Polo Grounds, where they expanded the seating, made it a little bit more like a modern baseball park of the time period. This is where the team played in this iteration of the stadium from all the way from 1911 to 1957. And this is where we saw many historic moments that are tied into the Giants. We saw multiple World Series held there. We saw legendary performances from guys like Christy Mathewson and Willie Mays. And the Polo Grounds 4 kept that deep center field from the original iteration. And those unique dimensions also stayed in play. So it was just one of those places, you wish you could see if you had a time machine. Had those short distances to the foul poles, this really deep center field. And it was a place that you really had to pay attention when you were playing. This is where we saw the shot heard around the world. This was the place where that occurred, the Polo Grounds. Like I said, this sanctuary of baseball. This is where the Giants called home. Let's skip over to team logos and uniforms. Let's talk about what did the team look like to people that went out to see them play. So the New York Giants logo and uniforms evolved somewhat significantly throughout their history, and it reflected the different periods, I think, culturally in terms of American history, of how they changed to different types of logos, different types of fonts, different uses of color. They were really on the cutting edge in a lot of ways of uniform design. So let me take you through some examples of that. Initially, the team's logo was a simple NY next to each other, and their uniforms were similar. The first version said New York, simply written across the chest. They had logoless caps, and of course, they had that in-fashion collar with the baggy pants and the high socks. Their home jerseys were white, their away jerseys were gray, and they had a black trim to them. Very simple to produce, very simple in terms of the time period fashion. But then in 1904, the team decided to update their logo, and they adopted this interlocking NY where the letters overlapped each other. And it looks very similar to the modern logo we see for the Yankees. So it had a different font style. And again, there's callbacks to the Mets too that you're going to see. Now, this logo stayed as the primary logo for the team throughout its history from that point on, although they did experiment with the colors over the years. The team also updated its jerseys that same year. They got rid of the full spelling of New York and instead introduced just an N on the left side of the jersey and a Y on the right side of the jersey. And the team experimented with other designs as history went on. And to give you some examples of that, because there were some pretty cool things that they tried out. In 1905, they made a bold fashion statement for the World Series. They introduced an all-black uniform, and they actually kept it in later seasons after that year as an alternate jersey. This was pretty fashion-forward for the time period. In 1910, they got rid of the wording across the chest, the New York, and then, what came of the NY. They got rid of all the lettering on the chest, and they placed that interlocking NY logo on the sleeve only. In 1911, they introduced pinstripes to their uniforms, another Yankee-esque look ahead of its time. In 1919, the team went back to putting letters on the chest, and this time they decided to write the name Giants instead of the city, and they did it in red instead of listing not only the black, but, the city on there. And then in 1924, they decided to lean into using more color in their uniforms, and they decided to change those pinstripes that they introduced to a red to match the logo. In 1933, they decided to change their uniform colors to black and orange. So some foreshadowing there to think about, right? And then in 1936, we saw them switch to a blue and white with orange outlines going into that New York Mets vibe that I had mentioned. So this blend of tradition, they made small little innovations to the logo and the uniform. It helped the Giants establish a strong visual identity in the baseball world. And that's why I bring this up. teams playing and trying to coordinate different ways to be able to stand out and give the fans something exciting to be able to, literally emulate. And the Giants were at the forefront of that. So that's an overview of their team logos and uniforms. Let's overview famous players to put on that uniform to wear the Giants colors. I mean, so many names to point out, but just to give you a quick overview of the top players to wear the New York Giants logo. We'll start off with Christy Mathewson, also known as the Big Six. He was one of baseball's earliest pitching legends, and he played for the Giants for 16 years, from 1900 to 1916. During that time, he had 373 wins, 2,507 strikeouts, and a career ERA of 2.13. Wow. He was also instrumental in the Giants' World Series victories in 1905, 1911, and 1913, and he was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1936. Then you have Mel Ott. Ott played his entire 21-year career with the Giants, and he became the first National League player to surpass 500 home runs. He's only one of 4 players in history, and he was the first player in the National League with at least 1,800 runs scored, 1,800 RBI, and 1,700 walks. Now, he was known for having this really distinctive high leg kick, and it made him an iconic figure of the time period. And he's another Hall of Famer. He was inducted in 1951. Then you have the great Willie Mays. He's considered one of the greatest all-around players in baseball history. He was a Giant, not only in New York, but also in San Francisco. He played for the team from 1951 to 1957. During Mays' career, he hit 660 home runs, 12 gold gloves. He was a 24-time All-Star. He made that famous over-the-shoulder miracle catch in the 1954 World Series. It's one of baseball's most memorable moments. Did that with the Giants. And Mays was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1979. The list goes on. We had John McGraw. He was the manager of the Giants from 1902 to 1932. We're going to talk more about him in a second. He led the Giants to 10 National League pennants and 3 World Series titles. And he was known early on as being a guy that really was not afraid to show fiery leadership. He tried innovative strategies on the field. And he was one of the guys that I think really showed that managers mattered to baseball clubs, how they could really have an impact on their team's success in baseball's early years. You have Hoyt Wilhelm, the father of the knuckleball. He was the first pitcher to throw a no-hitter in relief, and he did that in 1958, and he did it with the Giants. His career spanned over 2 decades, and he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1985. You had Monty Irvin, who was one of the first guys and a key figure in breaking baseball's color barrier. So he was crucial to the Giants' 1951 and 1954 pennant-winning teams. He led the National League in RBI in 1951. He was instrumental in that 1954 World Series victory, and he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1973. And then to round it out, you got Willie McCovey. He was one of the most feared power hitters of his era. He spent most of his career with the Giants. He won the National League Rookie of the Year award in 1959. He was the National League MVP in 1969, and he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1986. And to this day, you have McCovey Cove at Oracle Park that was named in his honor. So that's a quick overview. There were multiple Hall of Famers, guys that are household names to baseball fans that wore the New York Giants uniform. For this next section, I want to take you through the Giants' history and go through their main eras, what happened in each period of their history before they ended up declining as a franchise and picking up stakes and moving somewhere else. So the first period I want to talk about is the 1800s. They were founded in 1883. What was it like for those first 17 years? So it didn't take long for the Giants to establish themselves as a dominant franchise, like we talked about. They were getting fed the top players from the American Association's New York Metropolitans. And in 1888, they won their first National League pennant over the St. Louis Browns. And they repeated as champions in 1889 when they defeated the Brooklyn Bridegrooms. So these were early successes. They had star players that were becoming household names for professional baseball, guys like Buck Ewing, Roger Connor, Tim Keefe. And the good times kept rolling, I guess, for them. So we had those 2 pennant wins. In 1890, we saw a little jump, a change of fate for the team that's quite interesting. And we're going to do an episode on this by itself. In 1890, nearly all of the Giants' top players left the National League and decided to go join a new league called the Players League. And this league also had a team called the New York Giants. So you saw players leaving the New York Giants and going to play for the New York Giants in a competing league. Now, that season was devastating for the original New York Giants, and it led to a sixth-place finish, and ownership was really worried that they weren't going to be able to keep the doors open. But luckily for them, the Players League dissolved after just one season, and the fallout from that caused co-owner, remember John B. Day, the tobacco titan? He decided after that situation that he was going to sell his stake in the team. Didn't want to go through that again, losing players, trying to get them back. So he sold his stake to a real estate developer in New York named Edward Talcott. Now, Talcott wanted the team to himself, and he knew that even though Day was leaving, you had the other founding owner of the New York Giants, which was Jim Mutry. So as a condition of the sale, Talcott said that, I don't want him anywhere near my club. Even though he's a co-owner, he can't be involved with the day-to-day running of the team. He can't manage the team. You got to get rid of him. And John B. Day agreed to that, and Mutry was removed from baseball operations, unfortunately. So you really had one guy now calling the shots for the Giants, Edward Talcott. But Talcott wasn't around for very long. He was 5 years in when he decided that was enough. So in 1895, he sold the team to another real estate developer, a guy named Andrew Friedman, who had ties to the infamous corrupt political machine known as Tammany Hall. For my New York or U.S. history enthusiasts, you'll recognize that name immediately. So we had some less than savory individuals starting to take control of the New York Giants. Now, Friedman, once he took control of the team at the end of the 1800s, it was almost all bad press for the Giants, unfortunately. Friedman was not a guy to handle things lightly. So he had multiple disputes with other owners in the National League. He got into fights with city sports writers who wrote negative things about the team, and he would even get into it with his own players. As an example, the biggest scandal involved him and his star pitcher, a guy named Amos Russi. So Friedman tried to lowball Russi, who had a good year in 1895, and said, I'm only going to pay you $2,500 for the 1896 season. And Russi said, that's not what I'm worth. I'm not going to play if that's what you pay me. And he sat out the entire season, which was a big deal for two reasons. Number one, the Giants lost their top player, which hurt their win total, but it also caused attendance to drop significantly across the league, not only for the Giants, but for the fans that wanted to come out and see him pitch when they visited other stadiums. So at the end of that 1896 season, you had other owners in the National League get together, and they collected amongst themselves $50,000 to get Russi to return the following season because the team's own manager was too cheap to pay him. So the early years of the team, those 1800s, they brought success. I mean, they had pennant winning years, but they also had a lot of ownership changes, had a lot of scandals. And that was the first 17 years, give or take, that first era of the New York Giants history. In 1902, we start a new era called what I like to call the golden years. And this lasted for about 30 years, 1902 to 1932. This was the high point for this franchise. And they really achieved juggernaut status during this time. And they did it under the management of a guy I mentioned to you previously, John McGraw. He led the team for those 30 years. And during that time, he won 10 National League pennants and 3 World Series titles. Now, he fielded a heck of a team during this time. So just to go through this real quick, this was the era where the Giants featured players like Christy Mathewson, who we mentioned before, Mel Ott, who we mentioned before. They had Iron Man Joe McGinty. He was this durable and effective pitcher who would often pitch on consecutive days without any rest, which is where he got the nickname Iron Joe. And he led the league in wins 5 times. You had Rogers Hornsby. He was acquired in 1927. He brought his exceptional hitting skill to the Giants, and he led the league in batting average several times. You had Casey Stengel. He was known for being a charismatic guy. He played for the Giants in the early 1920s. He hit the first World Series home run in Yankee Stadium in 1923. And of course, he became a legendary manager later on in his post playing career. He put on the New York Giants uniform during this time. And then you had Jim Thorpe. Yes, one of the most famous multi-sport athletes of all time. He brought his athleticism to the baseball field, to the polo grounds, and he played for the Giants for a short stint. I mean, he didn't do anything extremely significant in his baseball career, but this was a guy who was known for being a top-notch football player and, of course, an Olympic winner, an Olympic athlete. He's one of my favorite, guys of all time in terms of personalities in sports. He also played for the Giants during this time. So you've got lineups like that over this 30-year period, and you've got McGraw leading them. And he really helped the Giants have this sustainable powerhouse run where they had strong pitching, they had solid defense, they had timely hitting, and they faced fierce competition. This was a high point in a lot of ways for other teams putting together power clubs. You had the Chicago Cubs, you had the Philadelphia Phillies. They were consistently good during this time as well. But consistently, the Giants were at the top of the National League standings. So if we're looking at specific games or specific incidents that happened during this time that are notable in baseball history, there's several. Let me take you through some of them. First one, you had an incident known as Fred Merkle's infamous boner. It's not what you think. Let me explain, which was exactly something that got a lot of coverage during this time. So there was a crucial game against the Chicago Cubs. We have a pennant series between them and the Giants. You had a guy named Fred Merkle on the Giants who failed to touch second base after a game-winning hit, and it led to him being called out on that technicality. And that error cost the Giants the pennant in a heartbreaking game. So that wasn't something that happened during this golden years era. You also in 1908, because of that heartbreaking loss after that error, the Cubs evened up the World Series and a tiebreaker game was ordered by the National League's president, Ty Pullman. So the morning of that makeup game to figure out who was going to win the pennant, upset Giants fans who were still upset at Merkle from the day before set fire to the bleachers of the stadium where the game was going to be played. Now, despite that, the National League president said that the game must go on. And they ended up playing that game and they ended up losing 4-2. So it was a tough year, 1908, for the Giants. And to make matters worse, after that loss, even after the second base skip by Merkle, it came out in the press that an unnamed Giants player had approached the home plate umpire for that game and tried to bribe him to swing the game their way. So this was a low point, but certainly a memorable point during this time for the Giants. This was also the last pennant that the Cubs would win for 108 years. This year. We talk about the Billy Goat curse. There you have it. You had another situation in 1912 during this period called Snodgrass's Muff. Snodgrass's Muff, excuse me. I said that wrong. So in 1912, you had a World Series match between the Giants and the Boston Red Sox. And outfielder Fred Snodgrass for the Giants dropped a routine fly ball in the 10th inning of the game. And that error contributed to the Giants losing that series, this intense series between them and one of their rivals, the Red Sox. But on high points, even though those were two low memorable points for the Giants during this time, you had back-to-back World Series wins in 1921 and 1922. So they did this against their crosstown rivals, the New York Yankees. So those wins helped solidify their dominance during that decade. During the 1920s, there were strategic plays, there were outstanding performances. Guys like Frankie Frisch and Ross Youngs were really instrumental during this decade to be able to help add even more hardware, more accolades to this club's history. In 1923, you had Casey Stengel hit an inside-the-park home run against the New York Yankees during the first game of the World Series. And this was Stengel, one of his coming out parties during this time, where he really showed off his potential, his speed, his talent, everything, all of the above. So those were some of the main events, even though there were ups and downs of the Giants' dominance during these years. And it helped solidify their status. They're one of the premier franchises in baseball during these early years. Let's look at the third era of the Giants' history, which I like to call memorable moments abound. This was from about 1933 to 1954. So even though, we saw in the previous area some lows, there were also some highs. We saw a changing of the guard for the first time during this period. Remember, we talked about John McGraw, who led this team for 30 years. He decided to step down due to health concerns and just general fatigue from 30 years of managing. And the reins were given to player manager Bill Terry. And he stepped up. He kept things going. He kept the team competitive for the next 9 seasons. And they won 3 pennants during this time. So the departure of McGraw didn't stop the winning. Terry was more than able to step in and take over the club. And he did a great job doing it. So what are some notable moments from this era? In 1933, the Giants won the World Series after losing that manager just a year after McGraw's departure. They decided to get it together. They won another World Series. They did it against the Washington Senators in 5 games. In 1934, you had Carl Hubbell. He was a southpaw pitcher for the Giants. He was nicknamed King Carl. Some people called him the meal ticket. He gained fame during the 1934 All-Star Game by striking out 5 future Hall of Famers in a row. So just imagine this for a second, right? During the All-Star Game, he struck out in succession Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Jimmy Fox, Al Simmons, and Joe Cronin. Wow. And keep in mind, too, this is back when players actually tried during the All-Star Game. So what a moment here again during this era. Just a standout time to be a Giants fan and a moment for the franchise to be in the spotlight. In 1948, you had a managerial controversy that involved the Giants that thrust them into the spotlight. So the Dodgers manager during this time, Leo DeRocher, he switched mid-season to manage the Giants. He came over mid-season, left the Brooklyn Dodgers, came over to the Giants, and baseball commissioner Albert Happy Chandler was not happy about this because the previous season, DeRocher had been accused of gambling, possibly betting on his own team. The next season, he decided to leave the team mid-season and go coach the Giants. Despite those challenges, despite that controversy that followed him, DeRocher was a very effective manager for the Giants. He guided the team to the 1951 and 1954 pennants. And then, of course, during this period, we saw the Giants field baseball's first all-black outfield. So the team made history by putting together Hall of Famer Willie Mays, Monty Irvin, and Hank Thompson. Now, Irvin and Thompson had both previously broken the color barrier for the Giants in 1949 and 1950. And then with the addition of Mays, we saw baseball's first moment where all 3 outfielders were African-American. So it really highlighted a moment that the Giants, on top of all the other winning accolades that they put together, they were really integral in integrating baseball. It wasn't just the Dodgers that helped propel things forward. They were a beacon of promoting diversity in the sport, and they certainly should be remembered for that accolade. And then, of course, another memorable moment during this period was when Willie Mays came to the Giants. And there was a bidding war for this guy. There were several major league teams that were trying to get Willie Mays. They had seen this guy. He graduated from high school. Everybody started offering him a contract. The Boston Braves came forward. The Brooklyn Dodgers came forward. They were ready to sign this guy to a huge contract. But then you had New York Giants scout Eddie Montague. He slipped in and convinced Mays to sign a $4,000 contract. Remember, 1951 money. So he played, I believe, a season and a half in the minor league for the Giants. He was called up in 1951. And he ended up being a huge contributor to the Giants right off the bat, not only offensively, but he effectively navigated the Polo Grounds defensively like no one had really been able to do before him. Remember, the way that the Polo Grounds were built, you had this really weird like oval shape in center field that made for an incredibly deep pocket that center fielders had to navigate. And Mays did it better than anybody else, being able to make that his defensive zone. So during his career, I mean, Willie Mays, right? Like, as we talked about, career runs scored. He's second in history behind Stan Musial in games played, 4th in hits, 8th in doubles, defensively just, above so many others during his time period. So this is a guy who had a long career, and it was certainly a high point for Giants fans to be able to see him wear their uniform during this era. Some other memorable notes during this era of Giants history. We had the shot heard around the world in 1951. If you're not familiar with the event, you have Bobby Thompson for the Giants. He hits this dramatic 3-run home run off of Ralph Branca of the Brooklyn Dodgers. It was the playoffs. It was a competition for the National League pennant. It's one of baseball's most famous moments. So the Giants rallied from a 13.5 game deficit in August to tie the Dodgers, and it all culminated in that home run, that walk-off home run that Thompson hit. That happened in 1951 during this era for the Giants. And then, of course, in 1954, we saw, unfortunately, one of the final top moments in New York Giants history, and that was a World Series win. They were managed by Leo DeRocher. Going back to him, they swept the Cleveland Indians in the World Series. And this was the series where Willie Mays made his iconic over-the-shoulder catch. He did that in Game 1. So in the bottom of the 10th inning, with the game tied, Dusty Rhodes hit a walk-off home run, and that led those Giants, who were underdogs in that series, by the way, to sweep that entire series. And the Indians were supposed to be the team that took home the title that year. They put together a 111-43 regular season record, 111 wins, and the Giants came in and mopped the floor with them in 1954. Unfortunately, that was the top of the mountain for the Giants, because this is where we go into the final era of New York Giants history, which I like to unfortunately call the decline and relocation. So from 1954 to 1957, it was a sad ending to the Giants' time in New York. Those final 3 seasons were forgettable, to say the least. They finished in 3rd place every single time. Fans were showing up to the park in fewer numbers during the 1950s, and this trend started to get Giants ownership thinking about leaving the state. Yeah. So there were several reasons why. Why were fans not showing up? What was causing the financial issues? I mean, you can't fault the team for being bad. They put together some great eras over, like we talked about, winning World Series, collecting pennants, just doing everything you could ask of a franchise to keep a motivated fan base. But there were some specific reasons why the Giants decided to pack up and move out of New York. Number one was the Polo Grounds, that hallowed hall that we talked about where they played their games. The Polo Grounds were in rough shape. Remember, this was built in 1890 and then built on top of, after fire. Its last renovation had occurred in 1911, and there was a lot of deterioration going on. On top of that, it had that awkward shape that modern ballparks more and more were being built. Baseball was expanding, and just what's the word I want to use? The shine had worn off on playing in a place like that. That was not fun for players. Fans didn't necessarily like it. The stadium had a lot of obstructed views and made it less appealing. When you looked at modern stadiums, like Milwaukee had just built County Stadium, which had these great sight lines, these new modern amenities. When you went to the Polo Grounds, it was a dump, and fans didn't really like that. And even if Giants ownership wanted to renovate the stadium, they really couldn't, because they had to cut through all this red tape, because the Giants didn't own the land that the Polo Grounds was constructed on. So there were some light attempts to try and update the stadium. They had to cut through so much bureaucracy, it never actually happened. So going to the park was not something seen as fun as time went on for fans. You also had post-war suburbia. The 1950s, there was an economic boom. We saw a population shift. People started moving out of the cities and into the suburbs. You had increased car ownership. Suburban families thought, hey, it's more convenient to just stay at home and watch the game, and traveling further into the city and going to sit in the Polo Grounds, which was not a great experience, as we just talked about. Coupled with the suburban rise, you had TV broadcasts become more accessible to people in the 1950s. So the Giants games were all regularly aired on local stations. So fans were fine just staying home and watching the game from the comfort of their couch. So it was convenient. It was cost saving, but it had the negative side effect of reducing in-person attendance, which was something that was very concerning for ownership as the years went on. And then on top of the declining attendance, New York Giants ownership got into financial difficulties, as happens so many times as we talk about other teams in this team Autopsies series that we do. So Horace Stoneham was the owner at this time. He was having some severe issues with declining ticket sales, with revenue. He was dealing with an aging stadium. He had made some bad investments elsewhere in his portfolio. And he decided that I don't think New York's the right place to be able to recoup my losses. So he started to look at other places where baseball was expanding to see if he could get a better deal on being able to finance a stadium, a place where more fans were going to show up to be able to recoup some of that money that he was losing from keeping the team in New York. And remember, during this time, there was a West Coast relocation trend that was underway. The Dodgers were already looking at moving to Los Angeles, and Stoneham was influenced to do the same, and he started looking at San Francisco. We're going to talk about that a little bit in a second. But other teams started looking west for their fortunes and getting out of the East Coast, getting more targeted markets where they weren't sharing space with other franchises. And the Giants ended up choosing San Francisco, obviously. So why was that? Well, believe it or not, it wasn't their first choice. The first place that the Giants ownership looked at was actually Minnesota, which was because of the fact their top farm team, the Minneapolis Millers, played there. And they thought, well, that's convenient. Let's found our club there. So that was almost something that happened. But under the rules of the time, Giants ownership gave them priority rights to a major league team in the era. But instead of them winning the bid, we saw the Senators end up there instead. And they became the Minnesota Twins in 1961. If you want to go back and listen to our Senators episode, I get into a lot of the politics that led to that. But really what it came down to is the deal that was offered to move them to Minneapolis. Minnesota was not as rich as the one that they got from San Francisco. San Francisco put together a pretty attractive package. So let's go through some of those things. Number one, the city offered a very lucrative deal to ownership. They said, we're going to build you a new stadium. We're going to finance the majority of it. You can have the city all to yourself. We're going to sign a no contract clause to bring in other professional teams. This is where you want to bring your major league team. This is a destination that has a big population, and we're going to pay for the place for you to play. So that was number one. Number two, we also had Dodgers ownership put their thumb on the scale. So Dodgers owner Walter O'Malley, who had already signed the paperwork to move his team to Los Angeles, but Major League Baseball went to him and said, look, if you want to go to California, it can't be just you. You have to find a second team to go with you. So he started calling other teams that he had, known were looking to relocate. And he spoke specifically with Giants ownership and said, hey, we've got a great rivalry going on here in New York. Let's keep the good times rolling in California. We'll go to LA. You go to San Francisco. We'll keep that north-south rivalry that we have here in New York. And that was actually one of the larger items that caused New York Giants ownership to choose San Francisco. Not only the stadium promise, not only the exclusivity promise from the city, but also being able to go to the West Coast and keep that connection. O'Malley was one of the major reasons that convinced the Giants to be able to go west with the Dodgers. So just like that, in the summer of 1957, the Dodgers and Giants announced that they were departing New York and they were going to California. And that left one team in New York, the Yankees. And they would remain a one-town team only for a short time, just for 5 years, because the New York Mets came about in 1962. But the Giants pulled up stakes and went west. So that brings us to our final section, the continuing legacy of the New York Giants. What's left of the team? What can we pull from that? There's actually quite a few things that still stand around that show vestiges of the team's influence on the sport. Number one, the New York Mets, when they were founded in 1962, they adopted the Giants' orange colors and the NY logo on their caps. It blended in with that Dodgers blue a little bit. So there was an homage of the Mets to honor their previous National League predecessors. And that kept the Giants' memory alive in New York, I think, in a lot of ways. You also have a very well-funded, well-organized New York Giants Preservation Society that is still around today. They work very hard to preserve the history of the team. They collect memorabilia. They share stories. They keep the spirit of the team alive through different events and publications. You should check out their website. It was a really, really interesting deep dive for me to check out and see what they were doing to try and keep the memory of the team alive in the city. You have the Smithsonian, our National History Museum. They have a whole collection of artifacts on the New York Giants that are continually on display. This includes jerseys, equipment, other memorabilia, and it keeps the significant impact of the team alive for future generations. You can actually check it out online. I included a link in the newsletter for you to see if you want to browse through some of the things that they collected. There were some pretty neat different pieces that they've collected that you can check out. You also have cultural references. The Giants had a rich history, and we frequently see it show up in baseball literature and documentaries. There's discussions about the sports golden age, and it's very hard to have those conversations without mentioning the Giants. You have the Baseball Hall of Fame celebrates players that wore the Giants uniform, like Willie Mays, Christy Mathewson, Mel Ott, all these guys. They keep the memory of the Giants alive by what they accomplished while wearing the uniform. And then, of course, you've got those moments in addition to the players. You've got the shot heard round the world, by Bobby Thompson. You've got Willie Mays' shoulder catch in the 1954 World Series. Those are all a part of baseball lore that's not going anywhere. And that happened because of the New York Giants. So they do have a special place in baseball history. They do deserve continued attention from future generations because of the fact they were instrumental in popularizing the sport when it needed it most. They have numerous championships to mark those, interest levels that they generated. We saw that they pioneered efforts for integrating the sport. We see that some of baseball's most treasured players that we remember to this day wore the uniform, and that cannot be understated. And even though they relocated to San Francisco and that marked a new chapter in the franchise, that Giants legacy still remains thanks to the New York Giants Preservation Society, the books and videos we watch, and of course, us talking about it as we, go through this episode and share it with other people. It's important. Remembering the Giants is essential to appreciating that rich history and evolution of baseball. So here's to you, New York Giants. Folks, thanks again for tuning in for another episode. It's been great connecting with you. I hope you enjoyed this. If you haven't had a chance, please sign up for the newsletter. You can get it for free and get the bonus episode, the This Week in Baseball History bonus episode. And then, of course, if you enjoy what's happening here and you want to fund us financially, I would be forever grateful for that support as we try and grow this movement. So with that said, I hope you have a great week. Thanks for tuning in. And remember, there are only two seasons, winter and baseball. See you soon.